Service Teardown, HP Pavilion 31.5-inch all-in-one desktop PC. Here are the required materials. Standard PC service tools, like a small Phillips head P1 and P2 screwdrivers, small flat-bladed screwdriver or a flat-bladed alignment tool, small smooth-tip needle nose pliers, thermal grease, electrostatic discharge or ESD wrist or shoe strap. Here's how to replace the chin cover. So before we get started, make sure you're careful with the chin cover. It's made of a thin plastic and can warp pretty easily. Again, being careful, we're going to release the upper edge of the chin cover and then remove it from the retention tabs on the chassis and remove. Now to replace this, we just slide the chin cover clips over the retention tabs on the chassis and apply pressure to the length of the chin cover and secure it into position. Here's how to replace the rear cover. We'll start on the top edge and carefully release the clips on the edges of the rear cover from the chassis. As you see, this can take a minute. Just take your time and go slowly to make sure you don't break off any of these clips. You might notice there are two rear cover spares. One is for the QHD display, identified with the letters AiO on the spare, and another for the UHD display, identified with the letters LGD on the spare. Slide the rear cover off the chassis and remove. To replace it, first we'll align the edges of the rear cover with the chassis and then insert the clips. Now we just apply pressure to the edges of the rear cover to secure it into position. Now let's replace the display stand assembly. Before we get started, we'll need to remove the rear cover. We'll place the unit face down on a clean, flat surface. This 2-in-1 cable needs to be disconnected from the motherboard. We'll then remove these 10 screws that secure the stand assembly to the chassis. These are P2 Phillips heads, by the way. It's a good idea to keep your screws together. Don't want to lose any of these. Now we just lift the stand assembly straight up and off the chassis. Now here's how to replace it. I'll place the stand assembly onto the chassis. Then replace the 10 screws that secure the stand assembly to the chassis. Finally, we'll reconnect that 2-in-1 cable to the motherboard. Here's how to replace the stand base plate. Before we get started, we need to remove the rear cover and display stand assembly. To start, we'll remove the 2 large sheets of mylar from the base plate. Now that exposes all the screws we need to get to. We'll start with these 8 larger P2 Phillips head screws that secure the base plate to the stand assembly. Then, we'll get to these 8 smaller P2 Phillips head screws. Finally, we'll remove these 6 P1 Phillips head screws that secure the base plate to the stand assembly. With all the screws out of the way, you just slide the base plate out of the stand assembly and remove. Now let's replace it. Slide the base plate into position on the motherboard shield. We'll go in reverse order from before and start with the 6 P1 Phillips head screws that secure the base plate to the stand assembly. Then we'll replace the 8 smaller P2 Phillips head screws. And then the 8 larger P2 Phillips head screws. Finally, we'll realign those 2 large sheets of mylar and apply them to the base plate. Here's how to replace the rear AiO board. Before we get started, we need to remove the rear cover, display stand assembly, and the stand base plate. To remove it, First, we'll gently lift the locking bar up on the AiO board ZIF connector and disconnect the cable from the AiO board. Then we'll remove this P2 Phillips head screw that secures the AiO board to the stand cover. Now lift the left edge of the AiO board and carefully slide the USB connector out of the cutout in the stand cover. Let's replace it. First, we'll tow the USB connector, then replace the P2 Phillips head screw that secures the AiO board to the stand cover. Finally, insert the AiO board ribbon cable into the ZIF connector on the AiO board and gently press the locking bar down to lock the cable into place. This is how to replace the LED board. Before we get started, we need to remove the rear cover, display stand assembly, and the stand base plate. To remove it, we'll disconnect the LED board cable from the connector on the wireless charging board and then remove it from the routing channel on the stand cover. We'll then remove this P1 Phillips head screw that secures the LED board to the stand cover. After that, just lift the LED board off the alignment pins on the stand cover and you're good. Now let's replace it. First, we'll place the LED board into position on the alignment pins on the stand cover. Next, we'll secure the LED board to the stand cover with this P1 Phillips head screw. Finally, we'll route the LED board cable through the routing channel on the stand cover and connect it to the connector on the wireless charging board. Here's how to replace the hinge assembly or stand cover. Before we can do anything, first we need to remove the rear cover, the display stand assembly, and the stand base plate. To remove it, first we'll slide the stand arm cover out of the stand arm. Then remove the stand base cable from the routing channel in the stand arm and the stand arm base. Next, let's peel up the tape. And then unroute the cable. Then we need to remove these two P2 Phillips head screws that secure the stand arm base to the stand cover. Now you can slide the stand cover off the stand arm base. Let's replace it. First, we'll slide the stand cover onto the stand arm base. Then we'll replace the two P2 Phillips head screws that secure the stand arm base to the stand cover. We'll need to reroute this cable and then reapply the tape. Route the stand base cable through the routing channel in the stand arm base and the stand arm. Finally, slide the stand arm cover into the stand arm. Let's see how to replace the power button board. Before we get started, we'll need to remove the rear cover. To remove it, we'll gently lift the locking bar up on the power button board ZIF connector and then disconnect the ribbon cable from the power button board. We'll use a non-metallic flat-bladed tool and carefully release the power button board from the adhesive and alignment pins on the display panel case. Now be careful with the power button board display panel case adhesive. This adhesive isn't spared with the power button board, so be careful that you don't deform it when you're removing this. Now, just remove the power button board from the display panel case. Here's how to replace it. First, we'll place the power button board onto the alignment pins on the display panel case and apply light pressure to adhere it back to that adhesive. Then, insert the ribbon cable into the ZIF connector on the power button board and press the locking bar down to lock the cable into place. This is how to replace the OSD board. Before we start, we need to remove the rear cover. First, we'll gently lift the locking bar up on the OSD board ZIF connector and disconnect the ribbon cable from the OSD board. Let's use a non-metallic flat-bladed tool and carefully release the OSD board from the adhesive and alignment pins on the display panel case. Be aware that the OSD board is secured to the display panel case with strong adhesive. The adhesive isn't spared with the OSD board, so take care to not deform the adhesive when you're removing the OSD board. To replace it, first, place the OSD board onto the alignment pins on the display panel case, and then apply light pressure to adhere it into position. Finally, insert the ribbon cable into the ZIF connector on the OSD board and press the locking bar down to lock the cable into place. Here's how to replace the system fan. Before we get started, we need to remove the rear cover. First, disconnect the fan cable from the connector on the motherboard. Then, we'll remove the 3 P1 Phillips head screws which secure the CPU fan to the chassis. Then you can just lift the fan off the standoffs on the chassis and remove. Let's replace it. First, we'll slide the CPU fan onto the standoffs on the chassis. When you do this, make sure that the rubber spacers are properly positioned between the CPU fan and the standoffs. Next, we'll replace the 3 P1 Phillips head screws that secure the CPU fan to the chassis. Finally, we'll connect the fan cable into the connector on the motherboard. Here's how to replace the display panel case. Before we get started, we need to remove the chin cover, the rear cover, and the display stand assembly. First, we'll gently lift the locking bar up on the power button board ZIF connector and disconnect the ribbon cable from the power button board. We'll then remove the power button board ribbon cable from the adhesive that secures it to the display panel case. Next, we'll gently lift the locking bar on the OSD board ZIF connector and disconnect the ribbon cable from the OSD board. We'll remove the OSD board ribbon cable from the adhesive that secures it to the display panel case as well. Now, starting with the lower edge of the webcam assembly, we'll use a non-metallic flat-bladed tool to separate the webcam assembly from the pop-up assembly. Being careful, we'll remove the webcam and microphone cable from the tape, adhesive, and routing tabs that secure them to the display panel case. we'll set the webcam assembly aside. Now we'll extend the pop-up assembly to the open position. Remove the 25 larger and 1 smaller P2 Phillips head screws that secure the display panel case to the chassis. This one has 3 display panel case spares, one for UHD, QHD with a TV tuner, and QHD without a TV tuner. Carefully disengage the retention clips that secure the display panel case to the chassis. Finally, we slide the display panel case straight up and off the chassis. Alright, now let's replace it. Now when you're replacing a damaged display panel case, you want to make sure you remove the power button board and the OSD board from the damaged display panel case and install it on the new display panel case. First, we'll align the display panel case with the edges of the chassis and then lower it into position. We'll apply pressure to the edges of the display panel case just to engage the retention clips that secure it into place. Next, we'll replace these 25 larger and 1 smaller P2 Phillips head screws that secure the display panel case to the chassis. We'll then align the webcam assembly with the pop-up assembly and then lower it into position. Carefully, we'll route the webcam and microphone cable through the tape, adhesive, and the routing tabs that secure them to the display panel case. Then we'll carefully apply pressure to the edges of the webcam assembly to secure it to the pop-up assembly. We'll then retract the pop-up assembly, closing it. With that done, we'll then guide the OSD board ribbon cable into position on the display panel case, and then apply pressure along the length of the cable to make sure it stays in place. Here I'll insert the ribbon cable into the ZIF connector on the OSD board, and then press the locking bar down to lock the cable into place. I'll then guide the power button board ribbon cable into position on the display panel case, and again apply pressure along the length of the cable to make sure it stays. Finally, insert the ribbon cable into the ZIF connector on the power button board and press the locking bar down to lock the cable into place. This is how to replace the motherboard shield. Before we can get started, first we need to remove the chin cover, the rear cover, display panel stand assembly, and the display panel case. To start, disconnect the CPU fan from the connector on the motherboard. I'll then remove the tape that covers the WLAN antenna connectors on the WLAN module. Now take a careful look and note which WLAN antenna cable is connected to which terminal on the WLAN module. You'll need to use this when you replace it later on. Also, be very careful when disconnecting the wireless antenna cables from the WLAN module. A damaged cable or connector can degrade performance. With a small pair of needle nose pliers or tweezers, carefully disconnect the WLAN antenna cables from the WLAN module. Then, remove the 8 P2 Phillips head screws that secure the motherboard shield to the chassis. Then, slide the motherboard shield straight up and off the alignment pins on the chassis. Here's how to replace it. First, ensure that all the thermal pads are properly positioned before you replace the motherboard shield. Place the motherboard shield onto the alignment pins on the chassis. We'll replace these 8 P2 Phillips head screws that secure the motherboard shield to the chassis. Being very careful, we'll reconnect the WLAN antenna cables to the WLAN module. Keep in mind that the motherboard shield is not spared separately. However, there is a thermal pad between the M.2 SSD and the motherboard shield on both the QHD and UHD models, and an extra thermal pad between the motherboard and motherboard shield on the UHD model. Then replace the tape that covers the WLAN antenna connectors. Finally, connect the CPU fan into the connector on the motherboard. Now let's replace the memory modules. Before we get started, we need to remove the chin cover, rear cover, display stand assembly, display panel case, and the motherboard shield. To start, we'll push both arms outward simultaneously to release the memory module to the spring tension position. Then, grasp the memory module by the edges and pull gently to remove it from the slot on the motherboard. Now let's replace it. First, we'll align the notch in the memory module with the key in the memory module slot on the motherboard. Then, at an angle, we'll gently insert the memory module into its slot. Push down on the edges of the memory module until the arms click into place. Here's how to replace the wireless LAN module. Before we start, we need to remove the chin cover, rear cover, display stand assembly, display panel case, and the motherboard shield. First, we'll remove the P1 Phillips head screw that secures the WLAN module to the motherboard and then allow it to raise to the spring tension position. Then, grasp the WLAN module by the edges and pull gently to remove it. Now let's replace it. First, we align the notch in the WLAN module with the key in the WLAN module slot on the motherboard. Then, at an angle, gently insert the WLAN module into its slot. Replace the P1 Phillips head screw that secures the WLAN module to the motherboard. Let's replace the M.2 solid-state drive. Before we start, we need to remove the chin cover, rear cover, display stand assembly, display panel case, and the motherboard shield. First, we'll remove the P1 Phillips head screw that secures the solid-state drive to the motherboard. Then, grasp the solid-state drive by the edges and pull gently to remove it from the slot. To replace it, first, align the notch in the solid-state drive with the key in the solid-state drive slot on the motherboard. Then gently insert the solid-state drive into the slot. Replace the P1 Phillips head screw that secures the solid-state drive to the motherboard. Here's how to replace the remote control receiver board. Before we start up, we need to remove the chin cover, rear cover, display stand assembly, display panel case, and the motherboard shield. First, we'll disconnect the remote control receiver board cable from the connector on the motherboard. Then, we remove the two P1 Phillips head screws that secure the remote control receiver board to the chassis. Then, just lift the remote control receiver board straight up and off the standoffs on the chassis and remove. Here's how to replace it. Before we start up, we need to remove the cable from the old remote control receiver board and connect it to the new remote control receiver board. Place the remote control receiver board onto the standoffs on the chassis. Then replace the two P1 Phillips head screws which secure the remote control receiver board to the rear cover. Now connect the remote control receiver board cable into the connector on the motherboard and you're done. This is how to replace the power supply fan. Before we start up, we'll need to remove the chin cover, rear cover, display stand assembly, display panel case, and the motherboard shield. To start, we'll disconnect the power supply fan cable from the connector on the motherboard. Then we'll unroute the fan cable. Remove the three P1 Phillips head screws which secure the power supply fan to the chassis. Then, lift the power supply fan off the standoffs on the chassis. Now let's replace it. First, we'll slide the power supply fan onto the standoffs on the chassis. Take a look and make sure first that the rubber spacers are properly positioned between the power supply fan and the standoffs. Then, replace the three P1 Phillips head screws which secure the power supply fan to the chassis. Reroute the fan cable. And connect the fan cable into the connector on the motherboard. Here's how to replace the CMOS battery. Before we get started, we need to remove the chin cover, rear cover, display stand assembly, display panel case, and the motherboard shield. To remove it, I'll carefully release the CMOS battery from the socket retention clips that secure it on the motherboard. To replace it, carefully secure the CMOS battery under the socket retention clips on the motherboard. Here's how to replace the power supply. Before we can start, we'll need to remove the chin cover, the rear cover, display stand assembly, display panel case, and the motherboard shield. To start, we'll remove the retention tape that bundles the power supply and the speaker cables together. Then we'll disconnect the speaker cable from the connector on the motherboard. Now remove the speaker cable from the retention tabs and set it aside so that we have access to the power supply cables and the connectors. Then we'll disconnect the power supply cable from the connector here on the motherboard. Then we'll remove the speaker cable from the retention tabs here on the AC in connector. Next, we'll take out this P2 Phillips head screw that secures the AC in connector to the chassis. I'll just slide the AC in connector toward the bottom edge of the unit, and that'll release it from the notches in the chassis. Then I'll remove the power supply cables from the retention tape and the routing channel here that secure them to the motherboard and the chassis. Then we'll remove these three P2 Phillips head screws. These secure the power supply to the chassis. Now we just lift the power supply off the standoffs on the chassis. Alright, now let's replace it. First, we'll place the power supply onto the standoffs here on the rear cover. Make sure that when you replace the power supply, you remove the AC in connector bracket from the old AC in connector and install it onto the new AC in connector. I'll screw in these three P2 Phillips head screws. These secure the power supply to the chassis. Next, I'll route the power supply cables through the routing channel and the retention tape, and these secure them to the chassis and motherboard. Slide the AC in connector into the notches that secure it to the chassis. Next, I'll replace the P2 Phillips head screw here. It secures the AC in connector to the chassis. Route the speaker cable through these retention tabs on the AC in connector, and then connect the power supply cable into the connector on the motherboard. Then route the speaker cable around the retention tabs on the chassis. And connect the speaker cable into its connector on the motherboard. Finally, replace the retention tape that bundles the power supply and speaker cables together. Now let's replace the speakers. Before we start, we need to make sure we remove the chin cover, rear cover, display stand assembly, the display panel case, motherboard shield, and the remote control receiver board. We'll start by removing the retention tape that bundles the power supply fan, and speaker cables together. Then disconnect the speaker cable from the connector here on the motherboard. Remove the speaker cable from the retention tabs on the chassis, and then remove the speaker cable from the routing channel on the ACN connector and chassis. Next, we'll take out these 10 P2 Phillips head screws. These secure the speakers to the chassis. Then, lift the speakers off the standoffs. And remove. Here's how to replace it. We'll start by sliding the speakers onto the standoffs on the chassis. Make sure that the rubber spacers are properly positioned between the speakers and the standoffs here. We'll then replace the 10 P2 Phillips head screws that secure the speakers to the chassis. Route the speaker cable through the routing channel on the chassis and the ACN connector. Then route the speaker cable around the retention tabs on the chassis. We'll connect the speaker cable into the connector. And replace the retention tape that bundles the power supply fan, and the speaker cables together. Here's how to replace the webcam assembly. Before we get started, we need to remove the chin cover, rear cover, display stand assembly, display panel case, and the motherboard shield. To start, we'll disconnect the webcam cable from its connector here on the motherboard. We'll gently lift the locking bar up on the microphone board ZIF connector, and then disconnect the ribbon cable from the motherboard. Remove the webcam cable from the routing channel here on the chassis, and then remove the microphone board ribbon cable from the adhesive here that secures it to the chassis. And then lift the webcam assembly off the chassis. Now let's replace it. We'll start by placing the webcam assembly onto the chassis. Then we'll align the microphone board ribbon cable with the ZIF connector on the motherboard and apply pressure to the length of the cable to adhere it into place. Insert the microphone board ribbon cable into the ZIF connector and press the locking bar down to lock it into place. Finally, connect the webcam cable into its connector. Let's go over how to replace the heatsink. Before we get started, we need to remove the chin cover, rear cover, display stand assembly, the display panel case, and the motherboard shield. First, we'll remove this P2 Phillips head screw that secures the heatsink to the chassis. It's here near the CPU fan. Notice that these next 8 screws for the heatsink have numbers adjacent to them. In numerical order, we'll start loosening the 4 captive P2 and the 4 captive P1 Phillips head screws. Now we just lift the heatsink straight up and off the processors. Now let's replace them. We'll start with an alcohol swab and carefully remove the thermal grease from the heatsink and the processors. According to the individual specifications for your particular processors, apply new thermal grease to each processor. Then, align the screw holes on the heatsink with the standoffs on the motherboard and GPU board, and then lower the heatsink into position over the processors. Now, in numerical order, we'll tighten those 4 captive P2 and P1 Phillips head screws that secure the heatsink over the processors. Finally, we'll replace that P2 Phillips head screw that secures the heatsink to the chassis. Now let's replace the CPU. Before we move forward, we need to remove the chin cover, the rear cover, display stand assembly, display panel case, motherboard shield, and the heatsink. We'll start by pressing down and releasing the CPU load lever from its retention tab and then pull it back. Now lift the load plate off the socket. Make a note of the pin 1 triangle on the socket and CPU before you remove the CPU. Also, when you touch the CPU, don't touch the contacts on the bottom side. Now, carefully lift the CPU straight up and out of the socket. Here's how to replace it. Find the pin 1 triangle on the CPU and align it with the pin 1 triangle on the socket. Then carefully lower the CPU into the socket. Swing the load plate down, and then lock the load lever under its retaining tab to secure the CPU in place. Now let's replace the GPU board. Before we start, we need to remove the chin cover, rear cover, display stand assembly, display panel case, motherboard shield, and the heatsink. We'll start by removing these 4 P1 Phillips head screws, which secure the GPU board to the motherboard. Then we disconnect the GPU board by sliding it straight up and off the standoffs on the motherboard. Now let's replace it. First, we'll slide the GPU board onto the standoffs on the motherboard, and then apply pressure to connect it into the connector. We then replace these 4 P1 Phillips head screws that secure the GPU board to the motherboard. Here's how to replace the motherboard. Before we get started, we need to remove the chin cover, the rear cover, display stand assembly, display panel case, the motherboard shield, power supply, speakers, heatsink, and the GPU board. Now take a good look at all of the cables connected to the motherboard and keep them in mind for later replacement. Now go ahead and disconnect all of the cables from the connectors on the motherboard. Then remove the 7 P2 Phillips head screws that secure the motherboard to the chassis. Carefully lift the motherboard straight up and off the chassis. Here's how to replace it. If you're installing a new motherboard, make sure you remove all of the components from the old motherboard first and put them on the new motherboard before you move forward. Also, take a look at the 3 thermal pads on the chassis and make sure they're properly positioned. Align the motherboard with the standoffs on the chassis and lower the motherboard into position. Make sure you're not pinching any cables between the motherboard and the chassis. Now we'll replace the 7 P2 Phillips head screws that secure the motherboard to the chassis. Then reconnect all the cables into the connectors on the motherboard. It's important to remember that after motherboard replacement, we'll need to complete post-installation tasks as required. These may include verifying functionality of the computer or updating the BIOS. Let's replace the LVDS cables. Before we get started, we need to remove the chin cover, the rear cover, display stand assembly, display panel case, motherboard shield, power supply, speakers, heatsink, GPU board, and motherboard. To start, we'll remove the LVDS cables from the retention tape and the routing tabs on the chassis. Then peel back the tape and disconnect the 2 LVDS cables from the connectors on the display panel. 2 LVDS cables are used in the QHD model, while only 1 is used in the UHD model. Now let's replace it. First, we'll connect the 2 LVDS cables into the connectors on the display panel. And replace the tape. Now route the LVDS cables around the routing tabs and replace the retention tape. Here's how to replace the backlight cables. Before we start, we need to remove the chin cover, rear cover, display stand assembly, display panel case, motherboard shield, power supply, speakers, heatsink, GPU board, and the motherboard. We simply disconnect the 2 backlight cables from the connectors on the display panel. Now to replace it, just connect the two backlight cables into the connectors on the display panel. Here's how to replace the display base pan or display panel. Before we start, we need to remove the chin cover, rear cover, display stand assembly, system fan, display panel case, motherboard shield, remote control receiver board, power supply fan, power supply, speakers, webcam assembly, heatsink, GPU board, motherboard, LVDS cables, and the backlight cables. First, we'll remove the three smaller P2 Phillips head screws. These secure the base pan to the display panel. Now, lift the base pan straight up and off the display panel. To replace it, align the base pan with the display panel and then lower it into position. Then replace the three smaller P2 Phillips head screws that secure the base pan to the display panel. Click the Playlists tab in YouTube to find HP videos in other languages. And search our channel to find official HP support videos.